First of all, let me thank the Malaysian Palm Oil Council for giving me an opportunity to talk about postprandial lipemia. I guess this is because my association with Dr. Kalyana Sundaram in this area goes a long way back when we were testing palm oil in a series of human studies with this model. Now, let me first start with the inflammation story and the disruption of the atherosclerotic plaque or thrombosis is blamed on inflammation. But if we roll back to the early stages of atherogenesis, which is characterized by cellular addition and attachment of monocytes and macrophages, as well as migration of immune cells across the vascular walls, all these are processes which are probably also triggered by dietary factors. Now, a vast amount of literature suggests that dietary patterns high in refined starches, sugars, and lipids are probably blamed in terms of contributing a pro-inflammatory environment. Even the direct pathways theoretically are supposed to promote an increased generation of reactive oxidant species. But even the indirect pathways are very important when we look at the pre-disease states, either obesity or insulin resistance, which themselves will start promoting inflammation or abnormal responses from dietary patterns. So either through the direct pathways, either through the direct inflammatory pathways, or more commonly, the indirect pathways, an inflammatory environment due to dietary factors could possibly be set up. And as you know, the end result are possibly contributing to the development of disease states, the metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, and atherosclerotic process itself. Now, amongst dietary factors, postprandial lipemia is a potent candidate, as even the ingestion of a high-fat meal systematically starts increasing a wide range of inflammatory mediators, the circulatory leukocytes, where the activation of NF-kappa B is known, upregulation of complementary system, and even your increase in plasma interleukin-8 and neutrophil has been shown to increase after a fat-digested meal in comparison to a plain water challenge. Now, even markers of endothelial cell activation have been associated with high-fat meals, in particular your tumor necrosis factor. Now, in simplistic terms, postprandial lipemia starts with the ingestion of a high-fat meal, followed by digestion, absorption, right up to fat clearance. But clinically, this presents as elevated triglyceride levels, and which is above fasted levels. Now, it's important to understand that the magnitude and extent of lipemia is itself recognized as an independent risk factor for cardiovascular disease. So, if you have an individual loading up with high-fat meals like these, the inflammatory milieu or environment can be set up depending upon whether the person has a capacity to digest fat in a normal or abnormal way. So these graphs represent about 20 individuals for a standard 50-gram diet load. And as you can see, individual response is going to be determined by whether these are people in the healthy or the pre-disease state, or at the extreme end in the disease state. Now, in terms of metabolism, postprandial lipemia is basically part of the exogenous lipid metabolism. But if you look at the physiological response to it, it starts with the packaging of fat post-absorption to the chylomicrons, and the degree or the rate at which chylomicrons are cleared or stripped of the fat molecules depends upon the ability of an individual to what you call assimilate this. Now, at the end of the day, the slower the fat clearance will depend upon factors in terms of the ability of the reverse cholesterol transport system to handle that load. So for a preclinical disease state or even the disease state, there are many reasons why the ability, the post-meal effect of metabolism can be slowed down. Now, at the end of the day, when we talk about postprandial lipemic risk, the bottom line is the generation of triglyceride-rich lipoproteins and the suppression of HDL concentrations, which you see come in the reverse cholesterol transport system. Now, and these two aspects, these two clinical markers are independently linked to atherogenicity progression. And this point has been absorbed into the old ATP3 guidelines, which recognizes that beside lowering LDL, that elevated triglycerides and low HDL cholesterol would be important aspects in terms of management. Now, the whole aspect is in terms of defining the dietary factors that can contribute to postprandial lipemia, prolonged lipemia, and the generation of triglyceride-rich remnants. Now, it's also, I've pointed out two focus points here, but these abnormalities are also common even in non-diabetics who have elevated triglyceridemia aside from diabetics. So separately, lipemia as well as hyperglycemia both cause endothelial dysfunction. So here we are looking at the fact that the focus is going to be in terms of looking at dietary factors related to fats which can be generated in the postprandial state. So aside from that, the other aspect, metabolic syndrome also has a problem in terms of high triglycerides and low HDL cholesterol. And these two are criteria for the diagnosis of metabolic syndrome. And you can assume that lipemia aspects are also would be targeted in the management. So for patients diagnosed with metabolic syndrome, in dyslipidemia, elevated postprandial lipemia is noted. Now, if inflammation is a mechanism linking diet to cardiovascular disease, it makes it important to understand postprandial lipid metabolism and the effects of fats, and the potential of dietary fats for promoting either faster or prolonged clearance is going to be in terms of clinical relevance. So, moving aside, why palm oil? Well, almost 50% of global consumption of vegetable oils are basically from palm oil. And since bulk palm oil represents about 99% of the business of palm oil, it's important that all health risk factors be studied. Now, when we talk about lipemia, the same aspects in terms of the chemical nature of the oils are important as in terms of the general LDL cholesterol decreasing strategies. So the most common oils, sunflower seed, soybean oil, rapeseed oil, palm oil, all have different proportions of saturated fat, monounsaturated as represented by green, and some amount of PUFA. Now, using palm or lean as a common denominator and fixing the amount of fat load, keeping that as a standard, it's possible to use palm oil as a comparison when looking at the proportion of polyunsaturated to saturated ratios and test lipemic response. At the same time, within the group of saturated fats, we can also check in terms of lipemic behavior And to extend our understanding, we can go on to looking at the effect of modified fats in this model. So the series of studies that I'm presenting here represent a standard methodology for postprandial lipemia, a standard load of 50 grams, and the response for fat variation is assessed in relation to plasma triglycerides over timed events, as well as the HDL cholesterol changes. Now, a standard meal that we have been feeding represents what we call a typical meal composition. In postprandial studies, the type of meal varies. Some studies use liquid formulas, milkshakes. Some use a single meal, 50 grams plumped or 30 grams plumped into a single load of a muffin. But here, our choice in using a complete meal is that we wanted to show that humans who are consuming complete meals are more likely to respond in a more clinically relevant ways than using milkshakes. Now, all these, the standard diet is isocaloric, similar in carbohydrate content, because we have to ensure that glycemic response is standardized, similar in protein content, similar in fat content. The only difference comes in the nature of fats. And all these diets were eucaloric with an average 31% fat energy. Now, subjects are typically healthy, and we use a crossover design comprising both male and female. This is a standard profile of volunteers in one of our studies. Now, subjects usually are habitualized or oriented on this postprandial meal pattern for a week before they come in for a fat challenge. And on the morning, they come in a fasted state, and following the meal challenge, they remain fasted up to about a maximum of 8 hours. Now, lipemia, in contrast to glycemia, the return to baseline levels takes a long time. So this aspect, whether testing lipemia at 2 or 4 hours, is controversial because an extended period is important to understand the magnitude and the duration of lipemia. So once blood is collected at all these points, it's possible to be able to look at the various aspects for evaluation. Now, the first permutation that has been used here is to compare palm-olein with the standard American Heart Association or the high MUFA diet. Now, the testing of this hypothesis originates from the lipid-lowering diet supported by the ATP3 guidelines, which recommends a decrease in saturates, more polys, and more monounsaturates. So if you can see, previous to the ATP3, you had 2 levels of lipid-lowering diets, one where the PS ratio was fixed at 1, and the other where monounsaturates were increased, pushing up the PS ratio to 1.4. So over here, with the palm-olein oil, the blended oils with palm-olein, which produced a PS ratio of 1.25, and with a higher MUFA profile, in combination with the meals, the higher PS ratios were related to the step 1 diet, or the higher MUFA diet, which is closer to the Mediterranean diet profile. At the end of the day, the sum total of these meals was that palm-olein provided palmitic acid at a very high percentage compared to the other 2. The middle road, the PS ratio 1, had a high amount of linoleic acid, and the last MUFA had a higher profile of oleic acid. Now, when we look at the first marker, plasma triglycerides, the response over 8 hours were not significantly different. Pink represents the lipemic profile for palm-olein, the green in terms of the Mediterranean diet, the canola-rich oil, and the orange line represents the higher PUFA oil. But on the other hand, neither total cholesterol nor LDL cholesterol were seen. I would say the total cholesterol changes were not seen here, and even your LDL cholesterol, when compared, showed that overall there was a marginal increase in LDL, but we viewed this as transitory. But the actual response, your HDL cholesterol, was seen to be higher for your palm-oil compared to the other two oils, the MUFA-rich as well as the PUFA-rich oils. Now, what we saw here is that generally dietary PS ratios tested in the lipemic mode did not significantly affect the triglyceride clearance rate and did not significantly affect the postprandial total cholesterol. But however, the lowest PS ratio, the saturate, seemed to be significantly increased in relation to the plasma HDL, and there was what you call a transitory response in terms of a decrease in LDL cholesterol. Now, going on to looking at the different saturates, the first pattern was in terms of a very rich lauric myristic combination, typical of a coconut oil diet, a palmitic-rich diet, represented by palm-oil, and a stearic acid-rich diet, which is produced by a high amount of cocoa butter in that formulation. Now, why were we testing saturated fatty acids? Well, it's been shown that saturates do not behave in the same way in relation to cholesterol raising. Lauric, myristic, and palmitic were viewed as cholesterol raising in a linear manner, and in contrast, stearic acid is seen as neutral towards cholesterol raising. So what happens in terms of when these three combinations were tested? Well, the diets, when made up, were typically high in palmitic acid for the palm oil challenge diet. For the lauric myristic, the levels were high over here, but for the stearic-rich diet, you could see that stearic acid was very high in contrast to the other two. Now, in response to the saturated fatty acid, the plasma triglyceride levels were assessed in terms of the chylomicron fats, and as you can see, in the lauric myristic fat was very high in relation to that diet in comparison to the other two, and similarly palmitic acid was very high in relation to the first permutation, and stearic acid was very high in relation to the other two, So the triglyceride response is interesting because it appeared to be related to chain length. Stearic acid with the highest carbon chain length had a prolonged lipemic response extended up to 8 hours, and you can see that it still had not hit the baseline levels in comparison to the palm-oil in green, as well as your lauric myristic, which is expected because this represents a short chain carbon atoms. Now, the TC-LDL ratios appeared to be significant as mediated. The highest levels were the lauric myristic, but overall, the LDL cholesterol levels, though there's a trend in relation to the chain effect, these were not significantly different. But HDL cholesterol, similar to triglycerides, indicated that chain length is influencing the lipemic response. And your HDL cholesterol was the highest with the shortest chain length, the lauric myristic, as represented by the red line, followed by palm-oil. But there's clear indication that following a stearic acid-rich diet, the HDL cholesterol remained depressed right up to 6 hours before it picked up by 8 hours. Now, what we can see with these dietary saturates is that the saturates definitely affect triglyceride clearance, and the chain length is significantly affecting with the slowest clearance related to the stearic acid diet, followed by the palmitic-rich diet, and the fastest clearance with the lauric myristic diet. And the same pattern in reverse could be seen for HDL cholesterol. Now, the last study looked at natural palm oil in relation to modified fats. And over here, the modified fats that were chosen was one, as a source of trans fat, and the second one is in terms of a neutral stearic acid primed at the SN2 position. Now, this is where the molecular structure of fatty acids are important, and for all saturated fats, the fatty acid chain is straight, and when it comes to cis unsaturation with a shared double bond, the option is that this becomes a bent chain. But with a trans fat, with a trans processing, an unsaturated chain becomes almost similar in terms of the linear line of the saturated fatty acid. Now, it is important to note that once your trans oleic is fully saturated, it appears to be similar in terms of stearic acid. Now, on the other hand, in natural triglyceride species, most saturates are sitting at either the SN1 and SN3 position, with the SN2 position usually cornered by the unsaturated fatty acids such as oleic and linoleic. Now, with interesterification, this natural alienation has a possibility of switching with the optimization of a saturated fat at the SN2 position, and this would mean there's any possible combinations over here. And in addition, the maximizing of an unsaturated fat in the SN1 and 3 positions. Now, what we can see here is that any fat sitting in the SN2 position will be well absorbed or would be detrimental in generating your TRL, and that is the line of thinking. Now, going on to the test fat oil formulations and the incorporation into diets, you can see that with the natural palmoline diet, which is primed to be high in palmitic acid, the fat challenge, which included trans fat up to about 3%, and interesterified fat, which had a higher stearic acid level here, which is at around 12%. Now, the impact of these three types of diets could be seen in terms of triglyceride response postprandially, and the right at the top was palmoline, followed by the trans fat and the interesterified fat line here. Now, generally, the lipemic curves were not significantly different in this model. The plasma total cholesterol patterns become different here, with the interesterified fat generating a very high IE profile, and compared to baseline, you can see that even that 1 week of optimization on these diets, subjects started with a higher baseline total cholesterol and the lowest was the trans fat line, which is expected because of the higher linoleic acid content. Going on to HDL cholesterol, you can see over here that the response for all three were marginally significant, with the palmoline being slightly higher, but in comparison with your trans fat, but not with the IE fat. Now, going on to VLDL cholesterol, we discovered that the patterns of VLDL response almost mimicked the response of total cholesterol response. Now, in the lipemic model, it's unusual to see this pattern, an elevated VLDL cholesterol or even your total cholesterol in comparison with the palmoline, and the lowest, the trans fat. And in addition, we introduced plasma glucose, and we found that this increase in VLDL or TC mimicked a higher profile for plasma glucose. Now, we must keep in mind that these were the same subjects crossing over to these three permutations, and they were all healthy, normoglycemic. But with this feeding of the interesterified fats, we can see that, sorry, let me proceed with that. A euglycemic state seemed to be set up. Now, looking at plasma insulin, we found that the palm-oleic diet produced the greatest initial response with a trend for 2 hours, and this was greater than the other two fats as seen here. It appeared that both the hydrogenated fat and the interesterified fat had lower insulin levels at 2 hours compared to the others. Now, the conclusion from this study was that lipemia generated by hydrogenation and interesterification was not a straightforward story compared to palm-oleic. And it was, even though there was a delayed return to post-absorptive state, what was significant here was that the introduction of interesterification seemed to change the profile of lipemic risk, not just elevating TC and VLDL, but also increasing glucose. Now, this data went on to a publication which has excited a lot of commentary, and up to date, there has been no publication to prove or disprove what we have showed here. Now, in summary, what I have indicated here is modulating dietary fat seems to be an important strategy in managing cardiovascular risk, and this is very much beyond the simple lowering of total cholesterol and LDL cholesterol. Lowering post-meal effects as a response to dietary intake seems to be important in terms of determining strategies for lowering TRL and increasing HDL cholesterol. So modulating changes in fat formulation is very critical, and any new formulation strategy should assess new risk factors. It appears until this current point of time that blending of natural oil seems to be the conservative management choice in terms of mediating better PS ratios, optimizing fatty acid composition, mediating what you call a heart-friendly triglyceride profile, and overall safer for the consumer. So until we see a state here where there's a total ban on trans fat, at the end of the day, the introduction of newer fats is very important. And from my point of view, clinical relevance should relate in terms of triglyceride management and HDL cholesterol in relation to post-meal effect. Thank you.